Bloodborne is my favorite Souls game, and I love its boss lineup. While I do think that FromSoft has continued to get better at making boss fights since this game's release, it unquestionably still contains some of the highest highs they've ever achieved. So today I'm going to show some appreciation for these bosses by ranking them from worst to best. The main criteria I'll be going off of is just how much I personally enjoy each of their movesets, but I'll also be considering other factors such as the music, setting, or just having cool designs. Plus, as usual, since I'm such a sucker for Bloodborne lore, I'll also be taking that into account here and there. Though I'll try not to put too much of an emphasis on it, since I want the main focus of the video to be on the gameplay. I should also note that I won't be including Chalice Dungeon bosses, though I might make a video on them in the future. And one more thing I want to mention before jumping in is that Bloodborne's boss roster is kind of interesting. I think most people would agree that there are a few fights which definitely belong near the top, and others that deserve a super low spot. But everything in between is kind of up in the air. This game probably gets the most diverse rankings in the series when it comes to judging the boss qualities, since a lot of them have very specific pros and cons which different people care about more or less. So with that said, this is a final reminder that the ranking is just my opinion, and you're almost definitely going to disagree with some choices. Now, let's begin. Number 22, The One Reborn. While I do have this thing placed at the very bottom, I kinda get what they were going for with it. It definitely seems like there was a decent amount of thought put into its design, but that said, I still think it's kind of a garbage fight. I guess I'll start by mentioning the positives. I like that its visual design is gross as shit. I think the opening cutscene is pretty memorable, the music is admittedly good, and the super loud blood explosion when you defeat it is weirdly hilarious. Plus, like I said, I do understand what they were going for with the moveset. The boss can be a little ineffective at defending itself if you come into wail on it, so it compensates for this by using things such as the raining body parts, the AoE explosion, the various limbs, the little explosions that can appear on certain parts of its body, and the floor vomit attack. But the issue is that most of these methods don't make for fun gameplay. The raining body parts can be an okay move if you're on top of it, but sometimes I think they appear just a little too fast. The AoE explosion is alright, the random limbs that kick you are okay, I guess, but ultimately just feel annoying. The random explosions happen too fast in my opinion, making them feel cheap, and I just hate the floor vomit. Wow, the boss forced me to stop fighting him for a while. How riveting. Also, when it comes to the more straight up attacks, there's really nothing of note to mention. They're just pretty basic and sometimes overly spammy. All in all, I can tell they were trying to do something different with this boss, having most of the actual dangerous attacks come from all these unorthodox methods, but I honestly just think it came out as a mess, where there's often too much happening at once. If you try to fight it in a more straight up way from the front, it's super slow and boring, and if you try to finish the fight faster by hitting him from the sides, then you have to deal with all these unfun and cheap gimmicks. Whenever I die to the One Reborn, it always seems to happen out of nowhere, and when I defeat it, I don't feel any satisfaction. I almost considered putting this thing higher solely for being interesting, but doing a Blood level 4 run of this game is what really solidified it for me as the absolute bottom of the barrel. Number 21, Witches of Hemwick. While the witches aren't nearly as annoying as the One Reborn, I think they're the most boring fight in the game. The whole encounter just boils down to ignoring the enemies they spawn and trying to find the witches themselves so you can deal some damage to them. After hitting them for a while, they teleport away, and then you try to find them again, rinse and repeat. That's literally the whole thing. Luckily, it can go by really fast if you're able to consistently find the witches quick enough, but if you have any trouble locating them, then things can really start to drag. And that's the main reason I don't like this boss. Fighting the witches takes practically no effort, but if you lose track of them, it can just go on for an annoyingly long time. Especially if you kill one, but then take too long to kill the other, leading her to revive the dead one. They can do an AoE explosion and a long-range grab attack, but that's all the resistance you'll get from them. Their one redeeming feature in my eyes is that the music is kinda cool and atmospheric, but other than that, I think this is the most sluggish and unnoteworthy fight in the game. Number 20, Celestial Emissary.
I hope you're hungry. for nothing.
That's this boss in a nutshell. I don't know why, but From Software really seems to have a thing for making these underwhelming fights where it's just a bunch of regular enemies except one of them occupies a boss health bar. Dark Souls 2 has Royal Rat Vanguard, Dark Souls 3 has Deacons of the Deep, and Bloodborne gives us Celestial Emissary. The main thing I like about this boss is just how it's kind of a joke for being so easy, and I guess it's funny that they decided to place it right before what I consider to be the hardest fight in the main game. But other than that, there's very little to say. By this point in the game, you should most likely be able to two-shot all of the regular ones, and when you get the main guy's health down to halfway, it actually does turn into a much bigger version, which can be surprisingly dangerous if he catches you off guard while fighting the little ones. But at the end of the day, it just has such a small health bar that the whole encounter is very unlikely to last more than 2 minutes. And that's why I have these little dudes higher than the Witches of Hemwick. Both are super easy fights that are unlikely to give you much trouble, but at least this one doesn't overstay its welcome. Number 19, Mikolash, Host of the Nightmare. I know there are a lot of people out there who genuinely hate this guy, but I think he's just kinda meh. The whole encounter with him is insanely different from everything else in the game. Before even fighting him, you have to chase the maniac around until he gets trapped in a room where he's forced to defend himself. And when it comes to his moveset, it literally does not get any more basic than this. In his first phase, he has one attack. Yep, just one attack. If he manages to hit you with it, then it actually does dish out a pretty solid amount of damage, but as long as you leave yourself the slightest bit of stamina after attacking him, dodging it isn't much of a hassle. Then after chasing him some more and dealing with his goofy shenanigans, we get to phase 2, and this is easily my biggest problem with the fight. お前はもう死んでいる。何? Yeah, he gains a new move in this phase that's capable of one-shotting you. Admittedly, as long as you make sure to stay relatively close to him, then you can probably get through the fight without him using it. But man, getting insta-killed by this guy feels so bad. Especially since it means you have to deal with his tomfoolery all over again. However, putting all the bullshit aside, I do admit that I kinda get some enjoyment out of this encounter. He has a lot of funny and weird-ass quotes, and his voice acting is super memorable.
Oh, majestic! A hunter is a hunter, even in a dream.
Considering how underwhelming the fight itself is, this guy really leaves a surprisingly big impression on the fan base. While the chase sequences can feel overly redundant and frustrating when you're new to it, I don't know, I just find his devious escape methods weirdly enjoyable to watch. Plus, the music is awesome. It's so chaotic and memorable, and I think it's interesting to see what's become of one of the most important characters in Bloodborne's storyline. This dude finally made it to a nightmare realm, and for what it's worth, watching him excitedly run around while high on life due to his new discovery is somewhat entertaining. So while Mikolash is far from being an actual solid boss fight, I'll still give him a bit of credit for at least being a memorable experience. Number 18, Rom the Vacuous Spider. I used to absolutely despise this fight, but nowadays I think it's just kinda okay. As far as the positives, I think the arena is gorgeous, genuine 10 out of 10, it looks so cool. And I like that you can tackle this fight in two different ways. You can either take your time and kill all the little spiders to make Rom easier to deal with, or you can just rush it and try to take out Rom as quickly as possible without defeating any of the little guys. As far as boss fights that include regular enemies go, I've seen it done a lot worse than this. Most of Rom's attacks are pretty well telegraphed, and all in all, it feels like they usually expect just the right amount of attention from the player. But there are definitely some downsides. Without a doubt, the worst thing about this fight is how much damage Rom and her little spiders do. Considering how fast these things attack, and the fact that there's just so damn many of them, their damage definitely feels a little overtuned. Also, while most of Rom's attacks are well telegraphed, I would still argue that some of them come out a bit too fast. Like the one where she summons meteors to rain down on you can be particularly hard to dodge, with the only consistent method of doing so in my experience to run away. But if you're low on stamina when she starts the attack, it can take just a little too long to get enough stamina back for sprinting out of it. Overall, I appreciate this boss for trying something different and not completely failing, but I wouldn't say that it's enough to give her a particularly high spot. In the grand scheme, the main thing I remember this fight for is just the lore. After defeating her, the Blood Moon begins its descent, which is what allows the player to start seeing cosmic beings throughout the world. Other than that, I mostly kinda just feel bad for her. Like, imagine your most noteworthy trait being the fact that you're vacuous, so much so that it's in the title of your boss name. I'm sorry, Rom. Number 17, Living Failures. I would say these guys are my favorite out of the game's below average fights. Obviously, when it comes to the DLC bosses, this is the very clear black sheep of the bunch. Almost every other boss in this game's DLC is top tier, whereas these things are just sort of serviceable. As a multi-target boss fight, it actually does a few things pretty well. I like how some of them choose to sit back and shoot projectiles at you, while others get up in your face and try to hit you. As enemies, they aren't particularly special in any way, but I find it fun to parry a lot of their attacks. Of course, in Phase 2, they also gain the ability to summon a shower of meteors from space, which I have to admit looks really cool. However, nothing about the fight itself even compares to the best thing about the encounter, and that is, obviously, the music. Seriously, no boss fight this goofy has any right to slap this hard. Now, if I had to pick something as the worst aspect of this fight, I guess sometimes there can be a few too many of them grouped together at once, making it slightly overwhelming. But as long as you stay somewhat patient, they probably won't give you much trouble. So yeah, the Living Failures is a fight that I don't have a whole lot to say about since it is pretty basic, but I also don't have much against it, and at least you get to hear some oddly placed epic music while fighting them. Number 16, Moon Presence. This is unquestionably the most conflicting boss in the game to me. Everything on the list after this point, I would say I legitimately like and find enjoyable to fight, but Moon Presence is the one boss that kinda sits on a fine line where I would say I do like it, but it's not particularly great. Let's start with the positives. Design-wise, peak. This thing embodies the idea of what I picture when someone says Eldritch Abomination. It looks so damn weird and unnatural, I think it's perfectly fitting as the puppet master behind the hunter's dream. Speaking of which, in terms of lore, this is debatably one of the most impactful fights in Soulsborne. The only way to reach it is by taking the steps to make it to the game's secret ending, which also just happens to be my single favorite ending to any FromSoft game. And while the music is far from my favorite, I find it to be a really appropriately haunting track. Plus, if you let yourself die to the boss and take a look around the hunter's dream, you can see that the sky has turned black and the moon has become red. Now, let's talk about the fight itself. My favorite attack is easily the one where she instantly brings you down to 1 HP, partially because it's unique and gives you the opportunity to get all of your health back due to Bloodborne's rally system, but also because it lines up so well with the lore of the fight. In most scenarios, this thing should be able to instantly kill you if it wants. It's considered to be one of the most powerful beings in this universe. But by consuming the cords to unlock the secret ending, it's like you've crossed your body just over the line where she doesn't quite one-shot you, but leaves you hanging with a speck of health. However, aside from all these positives I just mentioned, the reason why this boss isn't very high is because it's generally just way too simple and easy. If this was some random fight early in the game, then I probably wouldn't have much of an issue with it, but as the final obstacle blocking your path to the true ending of Bloodborne, it's underwhelming. I definitely wouldn't call the moveset bad, but it isn't particularly difficult, and it definitely could have used a bigger health bar. So, unfortunately, while this boss has a lot of cool things going for it, the moveset is most important, and the moveset doesn't live up to its amazing potential. Number 15, Margot's Wet Nurse. To me, this thing feels like the definition of a low B-tier fight. I don't think everything that it tried was a success, but most of the time I find it to be an enjoyable brawl. The best thing about it is how some of its moves are super satisfying to dodge. A lot of them can be pretty easy to see coming, especially if you're already familiar with the moveset. But when this thing does a giant diagonal slice with all of its blades at once just for me to zip past it, I can't help feeling cool. All in all, I think it's the first boss on this list where there's enough variety in the moveset to keep me consistently entertained. I also think it looks really cool, though maybe just a hair too edgy. And in terms of lore, despite it being placed at a really crucial moment in the game, we surprisingly know very little about this thing, other than its goal being to protect Margot from us. The biggest downside of the boss is definitely the nightmare phase thing it can just pull out of nowhere. I mean, visually I think it looks hella cool, but but I don't really like the idea of trying to damage the nurse while a clone of itself can continuously appear out of thin air and attack you. So I usually just bypass this phase by running in circles until it's over. Other than that, my only complaint is this one move where it shimmies around and slices in every direction. Like, seriously, I get absolutely nothing out of this, and it does it way too often. So while Mergo's Wet Nurse probably could have been better with more time in the oven, I still like it. Number 14, Shadows of Yharnam. While this is definitely one of the more forgettable fights in the game, I also don't have many negative things to say about it. Despite there not being any crazy or noteworthy features that make them stand out, after having a ton of experience with Elden Ring, I found myself appreciating FromSoft's well-made gank bosses a lot more. In my opinion, the two things that make the fight work as well as it does are the giant tombstone and the fact that the three shadows all have different fighting styles. The tombstone is great because of how it allows you to split aggro between them. Throughout the history of FromSoft games, one of the biggest issues with their ganks is when there's no proper way to separate the different enemies. But as long as you have something as simple as this one obstacle, it gives you just enough leeway to focus on one at a time. Along with this, one of the shadows is a melee fighter, one mostly just uses ranged fire attacks, and one does both, but with less range on the projectile. Obviously, this is nice because it means that you don't get three dudes all rushing you with melee attacks at the same time, which is something that can't be said in many other multi-target fights. Individually, none of them have particularly complex movesets, but they're serviceable, and I just love parrying the shit out of the melee dude. Once you get one of the shadows down to a third of health, then the fight enters its second phase where they become snake-ified, and gain a few extra moves like the super stretchy sword swipe. Furthermore, when you get down to the final one, you enter phase 3, which is also my biggest problem with the fight. It does make sense that the final standing dude should gain an extra powerful move to defend himself, but the move itself is honestly kinda whack. It summons a bunch of giant snakes for a few seconds that all try to hit you, but the way they appear out of nowhere and just flail around has never felt particularly fair to me. So I usually just bypass this phase by leaving the candle guy for last. Since he has the exact same sidestep animation every time after you hit him, you can get his ass stuck in a loop until he's dead, which works for me since I prefer a little cheesing to the stupid snake attack. So while this certainly isn't one of the most standout fights in the game, I still respect it for being well put together and decently enjoyable. Plus, their design reminds me of the Nazgul from Lord of the Rings, and reminding me of that trilogy is always a good thing. Number 13, Bloodstarved Beast. I feel like some people might consider this an unworthy low placement, since BSB generally seems to have the status among fans as a classic and memorable Bloodborne fight. And while I do enjoy it, I certainly don't think he's like one of the best things to come out of the game. The most noteworthy thing about him would probably be the design. Having those skin flaps turned inside out is a pretty memorable detail. Aside from that, the actual fight is pretty fun, though I have to admit, I think once you get used to it, he may actually be a little too easy, which is kind of ironic since I actually found him to be quite a nuisance on my first playthrough. The thing is, a lot of his moves are really threatening if you get hit by them, especially the grab attacks, but once you know how to dodge them, doing so isn't really that challenging. This boss is definitely one of the prime examples of the whole get behind them and smack their ass strategy. One dash is usually all it takes to completely avoid one of his combos and punish from behind. That said, it is still pretty satisfying to do so. While the actual challenge of this fight has significantly decreased since my first playthrough, I think the fun factor still remains intact. The one thing I've gotta dock some points for though is the poison. In phase 2 I think it's alright, but I really don't like it in phase 3, where it can affect you just by being in close proximity to him. Nonetheless, I still think he's a solid and memorable boss overall. Number 12, Dark Beast Parl. Unfortunately for Parl, he's the main boss that I always forget exists since he's an optional fight that happens to be tucked in the back of one of my least favorite areas in the game. And aside from that, he's also stuck in an awkward situation where most players are probably going to annihilate his electric cheeks by the time they actually find him. After getting to Yahar Ghul itself, his health isn't particularly hard to deplete, meaning the only way to fight him while he's actually fairly challenging is to get captured by a snatcher early in the game and find Yahar Ghul ahead of time. So if you want to have a fun fight with him, you really have to go out of your way to make that happen. But credit where credit is due. If you face him early enough, he's a damn solid beast type boss. Most of his moves ride the fine line of being threatening, while also not too spammy to the point of redundancy, and it feels really satisfying to keep up with him. Plus, I love how the second phase builds off of his moves from phase 1. Like, his basic swipes can now have projectile electric blasts that shoot out at the same time, which is not only satisfying to dodge, but also looks super cool. And speaking of looking cool, this beast has one of my favorite boss designs in the series. The way it's just this weird skeleton dog type thing with long ass hairs hanging from it, but then when it gets charged up, all of the hairs stand on end. I also think it's a really neat detail that you can get him in a down state where his moves lose their electric effects until he can get himself charged up again. Overall, it's just a surprisingly fun boss that I think I'll be going more out of my way to fight in the future. However, he unfortunately does have a few downsides. The first one is that I don't really like his big AoE attack. I think it comes out a little too fast, and sometimes it can be hard to get out from under him to escape it. Speaking of which, his lanky ass limbs can occasionally be hard to hit, especially if you aren't using a particularly long weapon, and the camera can occasionally be a nuisance here. Furthermore, his moveset would have benefited from a little more variety, but I still think Parl is a fun boss that definitely deserves more recognition. Number 11, Amygdala. Now before anyone rushes to the comments, I know that the word in real life is pronounced amygdala, but for some reason in Bloodborne they just call it amygdala.
Oh, amygdala. Oh, amygdala.
Anyway, this boss is so damn cool, and finding out that the fight exists on my first playthrough is such an awesome feeling, because after seeing these things all over the place in Yahar Ghul and getting crushed by the one in Cathedral Ward, it was a pleasant surprise to see that you actually get to face one of them in combat. My favorite thing about the fight is just how open-ended it is. There's really no proper way to face it. You can go for the most simple strategy and hit the arms to do some decent damage, or you can wait for its combos to finish so you can take those opportunities to smack its goofy ass head and go for the big damage. And you can literally just spend the entire fight standing behind it to bait the slam attacks for an easy opportunity to hit the head. These different methods of approaching the boss add a nice level of replay value, which helps keep the fight interesting to me. In terms of the actual moveset, I wouldn't quite say that it's an amazing one, but considering the immense size of this thing, I'm honestly just really impressed that they managed to make the fight work as well as it does. I like how in phase 1 it mostly just does some regular arm swipes, then in phase 2 it switches things up by also adding some cosmic AoE blasts to the mix, followed by phase 3 where it just rips 2 of its arms off and decides to go crazier with the combos. Plus, there are plenty of fittingly weird attacks like the eyeball lasers and the yellow vomit stuff. Now, when it comes to dodging this thing's moves, as cool and complex as the attacks may look, maneuvering around them can usually just boil down to running out of its range or hiding underneath it. I still like the moveset as a whole, but I do admit that fighting it isn't a particularly complex endeavor. Regardless, I still think Amygdala is a really fun and memorable boss. Plus, the design looks cool as hell, smacking its stupid head is unrivaled in satisfaction, and I love that you can make the fight go by in seconds if you use the Holy Moonlight Sword or the Burial Blade. Number 10, Cleric Beast. I don't give a shit if this is considered a hot take. Cleric Beast is an awesome boss fight, and probably my favorite tutorial boss in any video game. I know some people consider Father Gascoigne to be the true tutorial boss of Bloodborne, but I don't know, man. While Cleric Beast is technically an optional fight, he still seems to be the intended first boss encounter in the game. He was the first one I faced, and he left a fantastic impression on me. I love the way he jump scares you by just popping out from behind a wall. Plus, I think his design is really fitting as the first major encounter in the game. Just a mildly scary looking beast that pales in comparison to the horrors you'll encounter later on. And it would be impossible not to mention the soundtrack, one of my favorites in the game. Like, seriously, if someone in the comments knows any game with a tutorial boss theme that slaps harder than this, please let me know. And maybe I'm just biased since I have such fond memories of the boss, but I personally find that it somehow manages to ride a very thin fine line where the moves are simple enough to work as a tutorial for new players, while still being genuinely entertaining after countless playthroughs. No matter how good I get at this fight, I always find myself lost in it and just having an absolute blast every time. Plus, hitting the arms and legs enough to get some limb stagger on him feels so damn satisfying. Honestly, I think it's a severely underused mechanic mechanic that should have been more present throughout the game, but oh well. And I'll never get enough of those headshots. Finding opportunities to swing at that cranium and then follow up with a visceral is such a great feeling. This boss just has so many little things going for it that add up to a super fun early game fight. I know my placement of him is probably a bit weirdly high compared to most people, and that's fine. I have no shame being a cleric beast defender. Number 9, Ebrietas, Daughter of the Cosmos. Undeniably one of the most interesting bosses in the game. Without even talking about the fight itself, there's just so damn much to appreciate about her. In order to find her, you have to make your way to the Upper Cathedral Ward, the creepiest area in the game, kill some blue goofy goobers, somehow find out that you need to break this window, and find yourself behind the Grand Cathedral and the Altar of Despair. This has to be one of the most atmospheric introductions to a boss I've ever seen. Hidden away in this dark, broken down area with a light shining on her. Meanwhile, the creepy Upper Cathedral Ward music is playing in the background. It's such a memorable moment. And while there's still a ton of speculation and arguments around what her actual place is in the story, I feel pretty confident that she was intended to be the source of the Healing Church's old blood. When it comes to her design, this is one of the most convincing looking cosmic beings I've ever seen. It's so cool. Also, while the music isn't one of my personal favorite tracks, it's still really unique, fitting the encounter perfectly in my opinion. And overall, I think her moveset is pretty solid. She has a fair amount of different tentacle swipes along with head slams, and I like her unique projectile attacks like the weird blood shots and the awesome space laser attack. Plus, she's another boss with multiple viable strategies. You can either spend most of your time trying to get around her and attack from behind, or stay up front and smack at her spaghetti face. I usually tend to fight from the front, since similarly to Amygdala, hitting her weird ass head is just so satisfying. Now, considering all the praise that I just gave this boss, you might be wondering, why isn't she higher?
Because of that stupid charge attack!
I hate this move so much. It comes out way too fast and has an absolutely massive hitbox since it's basically just her entire body. If you happen to be in front of her when she does it, you just have to accept your fate. If she didn't have this one attack, then I definitely would have placed her higher on the list. Other than that, my only complaint is that I don't like how she sometimes gets ultra spammy with the tentacles. So to me, Ebrietas is an insanely cool boss with a mostly solid and enjoyable moveset who just happens to be held back by one major flaw. Number 8, Martyr Ligarius. I feel like this old codger generally has a reputation as the most underrated boss in the game. Whenever I see topics being covered such as most underappreciated Souls bosses, there's usually a fair amount of love shown for this guy. And while I personally don't think he's quite top tier, it is still a really fun fight. Ligarius himself just comes off as such a badass, and I think his opening cutscene is pretty cool, where he begins the process of thawing out after being frozen for so long. And I really like how this is one of the few fights in the game where the moveset goes through a dramatic shift between phases. In phase 1, he's still busy trying to thaw out, so instead of rushing you with melee attacks, he just stays back and shoots some magic projectiles at you, which are pretty well made and have a fair amount of variety. I find that they work nicely as a warm-up before shit really hits the fan. Then he decides he's done messing around and goes wild. My favorite thing about the switch-up is how surprisingly fast and mobile he becomes. Not only do his swings get a big increase in aggression, but now he's able to dash around the place and even start flying around at high speeds. This man damn near does a full 180 in fighting style, and I still find him fairly challenging to this day. The main thing that throws me off is the different speeds of his attacks. In phase 2, he still retains some of the more slow and methodical swings, but he can also start a swipe with his sword almost instantly. And that contrast between his moves makes it so that I'm still fairly on edge whenever I face off against him. I also love this long swing he does from the air. It might just be my favorite attack in the game to parry. Now, if I were to have any complaints about him, the first would be the big sword rain move, since it honestly just feels too overwhelming. Though luckily you can counteract it by shooting the sword that starts it. Also, when you're still getting used to the fight, his run back can be a little tedious, but all in all, it's still a cool fight against a crusty old badass on top of a beautiful snowy castle. It's a pretty fun time. Number 7, Lawrence the First Vicar. Alright, time for some controversy. Out of all the Souls games, Lawrence may just be the single-handed most polarizing boss fight FromSoft has ever made. This boss has some of the best and worst qualities of any in the game, and if you try to get any idea of a general consensus on this guy, you'll just be met with madness. Many people despise Lawrence because he's a reskin of Cleric Beast, his moveset is debatably not well made, and he just flat out does too much damage. But there are also those who consider him one of the best for his lore, incredibly memorable soundtrack, and well, just finding both phases to be enjoyable. Obviously by my placement, you can tell I'm more on the side of liking him, but I can understand both sides of the argument. While the first phase of the fight does lose some points for just being a reskin Cleric Beast with fire effects, I still like it since, as you know, I'm a certified Cleric Beast enjoyer. And I think adding the fire to some attacks is a nice way of mildly changing your approach to the fight since you need to space out your dodges a little more. And when it comes to phase 2, I honestly really like it. Despite him losing half of his body, he somehow becomes a significantly more intense battle. I think it's one of the most hectic boss phases FromSoft has ever made, and I believe it works really well for what it is. Now, when it comes to the music and the lore, it is obviously really commendable. It's so crazy to see what became of the man who was responsible for the whole Beast Scourge of Yharnam, and the soundtrack in the second phase especially is very fitting. So while I personally get a lot of enjoyment from this boss, I am still docking some points for the fact that the design and the first phase is reused, along with the damage admittedly going overboard. I know a lot of you probably would have liked to see him lower, but I honestly think he's great. Number 6, Father Gascoigne. While I do have my personal bias towards Cleric Beast, I would be lying if I said I didn't like Gascoigne more. The funny thing about this guy is that for some reason, I always find myself doubting him. In comparison to the crazy badass hunters and insane terrifying monstrosities you end up facing throughout the game, he seems pretty underwhelming. It's just a dude with some decently cool drip and a hunter axe, nothing special. But then I actually fight him and I'm like, oh yeah, that's why I love this guy. What Gascoigne lacks in glorious spectacle, he more than makes up for by just being a damn fun and well-paced battle. I think he works really well at essentially being the Genichiro of Bloodborne. He forces you to adapt to the aggressive pace of the game's combat, and once you're able to defeat him, then you've proven that you're capable enough to throw yourself into the rest of this nightmarish adventure. In phase 1, you'll be dealing with him using the shortened axe, where his moveset consists of a lot of fast-paced swings and some gunshots to throw you off. Then in phase 2, he elongates it, gaining a noticeable increase in aggression, and it becomes less likely that you'll be able to stagger him. His attacks can be really dangerous if he catches you off guard, but as long as you stay on the move, you can realistically keep up with him without too much trouble. And then you get to phase 3, where the whole encounter suddenly gets completely turned on its head. In an instant, the fight goes from being an evenly matched duel between two hunters to you getting chased around by a giant beast where he's way faster, does more damage, and knocks you to the ground with any of his attacks. Also, remember those tombstones that you could use for cover beforehand? Yeah, he just shreds through those now. This surprise third phase is so well done, and makes the fight even more fun than it already was. Though, admittedly, it can be somewhat trivialized if you're good at parrying. Along with the fight itself just being a blast, this guy also has such a tragic backstory that's laid out incredibly well in Central Yharnam, and after learning about it, it almost seems merciful to put an end to his rampage as a beast. Number 5, Vicar Amelia. My personal choice for the most underrated boss in the game. Throughout my time as a fan of Bloodborne, I've never seen a lot of positive discussion around Amelia. I feel like there are a lot of people who have a particular disdain for this fight, which I guess makes sense, considering that she has a fair amount of moves which are definitely a little over-punishing, and she probably would have worked better as more of a mid to end game boss. But overall, I personally think she's one of the most fun and memorable opponents that this game has to offer. Like I said, I do think she punishes the player a little too hard if they mess up, but once you get good at fighting her, dodging those incredibly dangerous attacks just feels so rewarding to me. A big part of why I like her so much is that I think she's the scariest boss in the game, without any contest. The way she howls, angrily swats at you, and scrapes at the ground, it's so damn intense. Seriously, she's like a kid who got her skibbity toilet privileges taken away. Even though Bloodborne is sort of supposed to be like a partial horror game, this is the only boss in it that genuinely gave me that vibe, aside from Ludwig. It's almost kind of hard to properly put into words, but there are few boss fights I've encountered in a game that have this same visceral realness to them. All of her moves have so much weight and impact that going toe-to-toe with her is just such an exciting experience. And combined with the fact that she's easily the largest boss you face by that point while taking place in the creepy and cool Grand Cathedral, it's just so awesome. Plus, she also has the limb stagger aspect that I praised earlier, and similarly to Cleric Beast, finding chances to get headshots on her feels so good. I also think her design is great, the opening cutscene to the fight is awesome, and defeating her is what gives you access to one of the most important cutscenes in the game, if you care about the lore. Aside from the over-punishing attacks, the only flaws I could think of would be her hair getting in your face if you attack from behind, the healing ability being a nuisance if you don't know to use Numbing Mist, and the fact that her theme is reused from another boss, but considering that it's one of my favorite tracks in the game, I don't mind too much. Number 4, Gehrman the First Hunter. As much as my opinions on these bosses have changed throughout the years, I've always considered Gehrman to be the peak of Bloodborne's main game. First and foremost, I just think the twist of the kind old dude running the hunter's dream turning out to be the game's final boss is so cool. And story-wise, it works really well. You can either let him release you from the hunter's dream and get the basic, vanilla ending of the game, or you can refuse and make him fight for it. And whether you decide to take his place or challenge the moon presence afterward to become your own great one, it's a really memorable finale. And the super sad soundtrack that accompanies it goes so hard. Luckily, the fight itself is also just one of the most fun encounters in the game. The best thing about it is how he switches between two different fighting styles. When he uses the fully elongated burial blade, the main focus of the battle is mostly just knowing how to outspace his attacks, and when you should come in to punish, since if you try to fight him point blank, he has some attacks that are particularly hard to avoid. Getting around the wide swings and parrying the moves with long windups is really satisfying, and his giant wind slice move is so damn cool. While this moveset is really good as it is, I personally prefer when he switches to the shortened mode, where it becomes a more fast-paced duel. I find it really fun to keep up with his quick swings in this mode, and dodging the gunshots feels great. Also, for some reason, I just love avoiding this combo in particular. I don't even know exactly why, I just think it goes really hard. Furthermore, I think it's cool how he gets powered up by the moon presence in Phase 2, causing him to get a new blue glow and become less prone to getting staggered. But of course, the fight wouldn't be nearly as memorable if it weren't for the setting. This guy was the first FromSoft boss to start the trend of fights with important, powerful characters taking place in a beautiful field of flowers. It's just such a gentlemanly duel. Plus, I find it to be one of the most satisfying victories in the game. After Gehrman spent who knows how long being controlled by the moon presence and forced to stay in the hunter's dream, you can finally put his suffering to an end.
The night and the dream were long.
Number 3, Orphan of Kos. Alright, let's be honest, at least a third of you who clicked on this video probably had a good idea of what the top 3 would be. While I'd love to subvert people's expectations and make a unique list, it's just so hard to deny the awesomeness of the DLC's golden trio. Out of the 3, Orphan of Kos does happen to be my least favorite, but I still think it's a peak boss fight. One of my favorite things about this guy is how he subverts your expectations for what the finale of a DLC should be like. In all of the other FromSoft DLCs, things tend to end with a bang, a super cool and spectacle-filled battle that leaves you with a sense of awe. But in Bloodborne, you just find yourself on the shoreline of a cursed nightmare realm where you see this disgusting newborn great one come out of the womb. And then, despite it being born literal seconds ago, it proceeds to whoop your ass. Yeah, before Elden Ring came out, introducing us to Melania, Orphan of Kos pretty unanimously held the gold medal as the hardest challenge FromSoft had ever concocted. And even to this day, he can give me a fair amount of trouble. Aside from just being a super hectic and fast-paced battle, the main thing that makes it as hard as it is, in my opinion, is the nature of how he uses his weapon. He can either swing the placenta at you like a normal hammer-type weapon, or he can abuse the fact that it's connected to him by letting it fly around on the string, which makes his moves really hard to predict when you're still new to it. But when you do get used to it, dodging his wild and frantic attacks is so much fun. Of course, he also sometimes just rips off pieces of it and chucks them at you, or somehow turns them into a big AoE attack. Then we get to phase 2, where he sprouts some wings and is sort of able to fly now, plus his aggression is somehow even more ramped up. His combos last way longer, he can close distance like it's nothing, he throws more placenta balls at a time, and he can somehow call upon his dead mother to produce a lightning shockwave. Needless to say, it's ruthless, frantic as hell, and I absolutely love it. In addition to the fight just being well made, I also get a lot of satisfaction freeing this infant great one from the hunter's nightmare. It's a pretty cool, yet melancholy end to an amazing DLC. If I were to have any criticism, I guess the music could have been better. It is an appropriately intense theme, but it doesn't come close to reaching the highs of the game's soundtrack. Number 2, Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. I know there are a lot of people who think this boss is overrated. In fact, I actually used to be a part of that crowd. At first I thought she was just a fun and cool fight, but not quite top 3 material. However, 4 playthroughs led to another 8, and I guess I eventually just clicked with it. One of the main criticisms people have towards the fight is that it's too easy, and while I definitely see where they're coming from, I think it's a little overbloated. Yes, if you want to make the fight a joke, you can just... and it will be significantly less challenging, but I usually don't parry her so that I can get more enjoyment out of it. Her first phase isn't anything crazy, but it is a fun little duel. It can be somewhat trivialized by holding the left stick forward and right, while dodging when necessary, but once you get to phase 2, that's when the fight really begins. Her new extended blood blades, aside from just looking hella cool, make the moveset way more engaging. Now you'll be punished if you try using the same simple strategy, and often have to dodge into her attacks, otherwise you'll get caught by the blood effects. Plus, she also starts using her big wind-up attacks, which are some of the most fun moves in the game to perfectly dodge. Then we have phase 3, where she powers herself up in one final effort by adding fire effects on top of the blood effects, giving her even more range. This phase is so intense, and if you're not paying full attention, she can catch you off guard and end you in almost an instant. She really feels to me like Bloodborne's ultimate human type boss. Ligarius, Gascoigne, and Gehrman are all fun in their own right, but Maria is just on another level. She really provides some of the most fun I can have with the game's combat. It's also a super tragic fight. The fact that she's so ashamed of what happened in the fishing hamlet to the point that she's willing to throw everything in her power at you just to hide it is pretty sad. She has many great things going for her, but I can't lie, it just wouldn't be the same without the music. Her theme is without a doubt one of my favorites in any FromSoft game, and I think it transformed a great boss fight into a legendary one. I would love to give her the honor of being my favorite boss from my favorite game of my favorite series, but we've still got one old hunter left to discuss. Number 1, Ludwig the Accursed and the Holy Blade. I hate to be predictable, but there's no way I could give Ludwig anything other than the top spot. He just has so much going for him that it's almost a little overwhelming. While everyone remembers this fight for the iconic second phase, I think a lot of people forget just how good the first phase is. Like I said earlier, he's one of the few bosses in the game that I actually found legitimately scary on my first playthrough. Just look at this thing. This is one of the most ridiculously grotesque, horse-like monstrosities I've ever laid eyes on. And luckily, I think it's also one of the best beast-type bosses FromSoft has ever made. He has such a good moveset that works surprisingly well for his size. Something about the tells on his attacks are so easily recognizable, and it has a great flow to it. There are also a lot of big, powerful moves that have super well-placed audio tells, like the loud screech before his big charge attack, or the small grunt you can hear before he falls down on you. While he has the potential to dish out some enormous amounts of damage, it feels like he always gives you enough opportunity to see these attacks coming. In my opinion, the only blemish on this phase would be the move where he wildly stomps around, since I think if you're under him when he starts it, then there isn't enough time to react. But then, of course, we get to the iconic phase transition, where the power of his Holy Moonlight Sword is genuinely enough to make him revert from beasthood and recall his human memories. And now, equipped with his unfathomably awesome weapon, he provides us with one of, if not the, coolest phase of any FromSoftware boss, where we dodge his spectacle-fueled attacks, meanwhile one of the best pieces of music in a Souls game graces our ears. It really is one of those fights where it feels like words can't do it justice. The only way to know what it's like is to experience it for yourself. Dodging his big AoE moves like the thrust into the ground or the giant slam creating a huge wave of moonlight is so peak. He has everything going for him and then some. Two drastically different phases which both rock, a peak soundtrack, a super hype phase transition, and some of the most compelling lore in the game. You even get an opportunity to speak with his head after the fight, and you can get different lines out of him if you disguise yourself as one of the old hunters. So Ludwig is without a doubt my favorite boss in Bloodborne. And as usual, feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments. I know some people probably would have preferred if this video was more streamlined, giving it a shorter runtime, but the more I wrote, the more I realized that I could just talk about these bosses for days, and I really didn't want to leave out any of my major thoughts on them. Let me know if you liked this, and if you think I should start catering towards longer videos in general. Also, as for my next videos, I might make something covering my thoughts and hopes for the DLC, depends if I think there's enough to talk about. And of course, I also have that Dark Souls 1 enemy ranking looming over me, which I know I'll have to put out at some point, but that's all I got for now. Until next time, see ya.